Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Yes, greetings, and welcome to another episode of African News Review. I'm your host as usual, Adesoji Iginla, and with me is our ever-present guest. He's a household name, Comrade Milton Allimadi. He is a journalist, broadcaster, WBAI, Black Star News. He's also the author of Manufacturing Hate, a soon-to-be re-released a book which formed the basis of this conversation that we've been having. And welcome, Brother Milton. And how have you been?
I'm good, comrade. Thank you so much for the work that you do. And thanks to all of our viewers and listeners.
No, I'm humbled. Getting kudos from a legend himself. I'm humbled. Yes, we were hit by devastating news on the African Liberation Front this week at the passing of Sam Nujoma.
Yes, well, thank the ancestors. He was blessed with a long and productive life. A life of struggle rewarded with the liberation of his country. And always, of course, this is another moment where we also honor the international solidarity of the sisters and brothers from Cuba who fought alongside our African sisters and brothers at the Great Battle of Puerto Cuanavao, 1987-88, destroyed the South African apartheid army, which led to the independence of Namibia, which had been occupied by South Africa and called Southwest Africa, led to the release of Mandela, led to the semi-independence of South Africa.
Speaking of semi-independence of South Africa, our first news comes from Washington via South Africa, and it's from the Washington Post, and it reads, Trump held aid to South Africa, claiming discrimination against Afrikaners. His executive order accuses South African government of seizing property from white landowners and calling for their resettlement as refugees in the United States. And there you see Cyril Ramaphosa and the President of the United States. The story is filed in by Maria Luisa Paul. And I'll read the first part and get your initial assessment. President Donald Trump on Friday signed an executive order halting all U.S. aid to South Africa and directing his administration to develop a plan for resettling white Afrikaners as refugees, citing what he called government-sponsored race-based discrimination against them. Is there any grounds for such a...
Well, it's good for his base,
Okay.
It's good for his base. It's good for, ignorant Europeans who voted for him. And of course, the danger is a lot of the Europeans in this country don't know the history of apartheid in South Africa.
Okay.
They don't know the history of racism in South Africa. They don't know the reason why Mandela had spent 27 years separated from his family and locked up in jail. The Sharpeville massacre, the Soweto massacre. If they had an understanding of all the suffering and the struggle led by Winnie in the absence of Mandela, the Pan-Africanist Congress, all the young people who contributed to the liberation of South Africa.
Okay.
So, it's painful that he is so self-absorbed that the suffering and pain of others and their histories does not matter to him.
Does not matter to him, yeah. Okay, I'll continue. And it says...
You can't boast on the one hand that saying when Mandela visited the U.S., in one of the trips that he made within the country, I loaned him I gave my jet. I left it at his disposal to use as he pleases. Can't even, on the one hand, say that, meaning you acknowledge the legacy and history of apartheid, and then come up with a position like this.
Okay. So the order accuses South Africa's government of seizing ethnic minority Afrikaners' agricultural property without compensation and enacting countless government policies designed to dismantle equal opportunity in employment, education, and business. Can I take a stop there and help me unravel that? I'll read it again.
Yeah, it's, as I said, it's like really defecating on the graves of the thousands of South Africans who died, the tens of thousands who died through the more than 4 centuries of exploitation that was formalized through apartheid 1948. So it's really disgusting and revolting that they would resort to that type of language and turn history upside down. But what it might do actually is, ironically, because my biggest concern had been, as you recall, when we spoke some weeks ago, we spoke on the situation in South Africa. And I had said that given the influence that Elon Musk was having over Trump, I would not be surprised that by the next election in South Africa, that the DA, the Democratic Alliance, the apartheid light party of European South Africans that is now in partnership with the ANC, could actually be the majority party by that time if things go this way. But now when you have these types of policies, actually it gives me more hope, because this is the kind of fuel that parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters and Jacob Zuma's Umkhonto we Sizwe need, because now it really validates what they've been saying all along. Not only the beneficiaries of apartheid in South Africa do not want to yield and build an equitable society, but now they're soliciting the assistance of a superpower like the United States to actually bully South Africa into not relinquishing these privileges that were acquired immorally, illegally, and violently. So exactly assisting the Economic Freedom Fighters and Jacob Zuma's Umkhonto we Sizwe. So yeah, let him continue with those type of rhetoric.
Okay. Now, so continuing on from there, he says it also claims that South Africa's leader have taken aggressive positions towards the United States and its allies, pointing to the country's decision to accuse Israel of genocide and the International Court of Justice and its deepening ties with Iran.
Right, but that's a policy that actually started under the Biden administration. So that's just a continuation of policy that was already in place. But the Biden government did not go against them on the basis of the accusation of Israel on the genocide. Yes, they were starting to already try to pass legislation in the U.S. Congress to retaliate against Africa.
Okay. So it's a continuation of the American project. Okay.
Right. And ironically, by aiding and abetting the genocide of the Palestinian people, that's why the Democrats lost. The Democrats actually gave away their base in the hope that miraculously somehow, Democrats would still, the base would still vote for them. It was, to me, irrational logic,
So far, would you say this article has been forthright or
it's been
basically
forthright, but what is lacking is putting in the context what I've just been explaining, saying that the administration is totally ignoring the history and legacy of apartheid. By now, we should have heard about that legacy. You cannot bury that down in the story, because this article is not mostly read by South Africans or people on the continent. This is primarily for an American audience. So it's very important by the third paragraph to start going into the legacy and the history of apartheid and why it is that a so-called ethnic minority Afrikaners are in control of more than 70% of the land, when European South Africans, both Afrikaner and English-speaking combined, make up only 8% of the population. That's very critical. That should come out very quickly, either in the second or third paragraph.
Let's continue. Let's continue and see if we... So now we're in the second of 4 pages article. So the United States cannot support the government, that's position of the Trump's government, cannot support the government of South Africa's Commission of Rights Violation in its country or its undermining U.S. foreign policy, which poses national security threats to our nation, our allies, our African partners, and our interests, the other states. South Africa has increasingly found itself in Trump's crosshairs, as he has claimed without evidence that the government is seizing white-owned land and persecuting white farmers, the Washington Post previously reported. The subject of Trump's criticism appears to be a recent law that allows land expropriation without compensation in rare cases. However, South African officials have said the policy is part of an effort to address disparities left by apartheid, a system that for decades barred South Africans from owning land. So, here we go. Land ownership in South Africa remains one of the starkest legacies of apartheid. White South Africans, who make up about 8% of the population, own about 3/4 of the country's farmlands, while Black South Africans, who make up 80% of the population, owns just 4%, according to the country's 2017 land audit.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight.
Yeah, I mean, this is fine, but why are we hearing it now in the story? As you know, the way stories are framed has impacts, right? And that's how people remember stories, the way it's framed. What it initially hits you first as you're reading the article, or as it's being broadcast on television or on radio, right?
Yep.
Because if somebody is announcing this on radio or TV and following this guideline, it will come much later in the story. So even if you are listening to it, audio, or you're watching it, on a television broadcast, this information is coming lead. This lead is being buried. This should be very high up in any story. Trump administration is saying this, but here are the facts on the ground in South Africa. And then you build the rest of the story on that premise,
And it could possibly be a question
and by now, you have some strong quotes from people countering these statements. You're just taking pieces from this very provocative and reactionary statement and piecing it here and there in the article without getting a knowledgeable African to say, this is preposterous. This is turning history upside down, given the situation on the ground in South Africa. You see?
Okay. That said, I mean, in terms of laws,
I think it's important that we give context to, like you said, to what South Africans on the ground actually experience in terms of day-to-day activity. In pulling up this story, I also came in contact with this, and I will share. And it's basically a rule of laws that the South African Ministry of Justice formulated during apartheid. And it reads, okay, so it says, anyone disobeying these laws will be imprisoned, fined, or whipped. All Africans over the age of 16 must produce a passbook on demand by a policeman. You remember the past laws? Under no circumstances may an employer pay Africans the same rates as white persons, even if they do the same work and work for the same hours. So Africans may strike for any reason whatsoever. Any African who takes a job outside his town, even if he lived there for 20 years, must leave that town within 72 hours. That is, unless they have...
The Nazi regime, which apartheid was,
framed
after, right?
Yes. So,
and here's the most troubling thing, actually, to be honest with you. The lack of appreciation of the humanity of Africans. And I always ask people this, try to reverse the history. African imperialists go to England, kill Europeans, take over their land, impose a racist system of African black supremacy in England. And then historically, at some point, this system collapses. Do you think 30 years later, an African minority in England would still be controlling 70% of the land? They would be lucky to be enjoying their life. Let's be serious. So the spiritual and human compassion of Africans being taken for granted and being abused and being defecated upon. That's what they're doing, abusing our humanity constantly, again and again and again.
I'll just take one more part of that rule. There's a part here. No person may have sexual relations with an African, colored, or Indian person, and vice versa. You remember the book written by Trevor Noah, Born a Crime?
Yeah.
That's it. And then there's one last part here where, no African may buy land or own property anywhere in the Republic. Under no circumstance may a non-white person use facilities set aside for the use of white persons. Finally, this harks back to Jim Crow days in post-Reconstruction in the United States. No white man may teach an African servant to read, by the orders of the South African Ministry of Justice. Let that sink in. And this is the starting ground for most South Africans in order to regain their humanity. And yet you have somebody coming in, upending all thoughts of what seems normal and rational and logical justice on the basis of a whim.
Well, I'm not going to repeat myself. As I said, let him continue along that line. He's only going to embolden and empower the economic freedom fighters and Umkhonto, which is sometimes what they need anyway. They need a rationalization for the policies that they're advocating, and Donald Trump is the best gift for that.
Okay, this is the time we put books forward, and there is one book that actually captures that period in time, and is from no other than the legend himself, Gerald Horne.
Yes.
And it's titled White Supremacy Confronted. And it gives you a run-through about all of that history of that time period before, during, and after. This is a powerful book, and it's titled White Supremacy Confronted by Gerald Horne.
The great professor.
And, still writing. He's a legend. And so, speaking of having a base of understanding, we go to military bases
And for our next story, we go to Radio France International. And the story is historic Chinese military base to open in the Horn of Africa. China is negotiating a military base in the strategic port of Djibouti, an historical development that would see the US and China each have bases in the small nation that guards the entrance to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. President Ismail Omar Guelleh said that the discussions were ongoing and that Beijing is welcome. That's President Guelleh there.
Yeah, but I was under the impression that the Chinese actually already had a base.
No. They were muting one, but now it's becoming concrete, as you will see in the course of the story. That was my original thoughts as well, but then only to find that they were mulling about it, but eventually, maybe they suddenly realized they had to go in. So I would read. Djibouti is already home to Camp Lemonnier, the military headquarters used by U.S. Special Forces for covert, anti-terror and other operations in Yemen, in Africa. France, the former colonial master, and Japan already have bases in the port, which were used by many foreign navies to fight piracy in neighboring Somalia. France's presence is old, and the Americans found that the position of Djibouti could help in the fight against terrorism in the region. Guelleh told AFP, the Japanese want to protect themselves from piracy. Now the Chinese also want to protect their interests, and they are welcome. China refused to confirm or deny on Monday that it was establishing a military base in the Horn of Africa. It goes on to say maintenance of peace and stability in the region is in line with the interest of related countries. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Huan Chuling told reporters, it is also the common aspiration of Djibouti, China and other countries in the world. China signed a security and defense agreement with Djibouti in February 2014, but a military base in Djibouti, the first in Africa, would definitely be historic, according to David Sheen, a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia. It goes on to say, China is reportedly considering a permanent military base in Obok, Djibouti's northern port city. China clearly has a goal of building a blue water navy, which means it will have some points go well beyond the east coast of Africa, the western Indian Ocean, and it has to think long-term about how it will be able to service its naval vessels as they go further and further, he explains. So, my question to you would be, in terms of sovereignty, how does that play for Djibouti, first and foremost?
Djibouti is not a sovereign country.
Sorry, wrong
it's
question.
Only sovereign on paper, unfortunately. I mean, there are degrees of sovereignty, and Djibouti certainly is not, one of the African countries that we can say is sovereign. And this is not, of course, insulting our sisters and brothers in Djibouti. It's just the nature of imperialism. Imperialism has a very strong and solid hold. Djibouti, because Djibouti, of course, is also afraid of annexation, you see? Annexation by its neighbors, including, it's also the regional powers, including Ethiopia, because
Ethiopia wants an access to the sea.
Ethiopia has always been salivating to have a port because it's landlocked, you see? So as a result, Djibouti has always had very solid either French presence, U.S. presence, and now Chinese presence as well. The sad thing is that for China, as you know, China has always used a different strategy in terms of its penetration in Africa. It's used its economic clout and the expanded business relations and trade relations between China and Africa to get ahead of the West, ahead of the Western European countries, as well as the United States. So it seems to me that it's not so much as China wanting to compete militarily against the United States in Africa. it seems that it's much more perhaps to reinforce China's commercial interest in the Indian Ocean. And of course, China is one of the many countries, including the Western countries, including the Arab countries, including India and other countries that have been pirating. They call the Somali the pirates when they're the ones actually that are stealing billions of dollars worth of and other products from the waters that should belong rightfully to the people of Somalia.
And dumping waste in the sea.
And dumping waste. So it seems to me it's much more out of commercial ambitions and aspirations rather than wanting any military confrontation or competition against the United States. Or against France for that matter.
Okay, I would take one more part here. It says Camp Leonore home to, well, you've sort of countered that in terms of confrontation would not be had. That is, then this part here, a new China deep sea port in Djibouti will be a new pearl in China's string of pearls strategy, according to analyst and writer Robert Mason, author of The International Politics of the Arab Spring. It will provide boost to China's sphere of influence, which already extends from the South China Sea along the west coast of Myanmar to the Arabian Sea coastal port of Gwadar, Pakistan, a major destination in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So like you said, it's basically just a way of shoring up their economic interest.
Absolutely.
Not so much as, saber rattling as the West would have us think.
Absolutely.
Okay. So one final point on that. How does that sit? You know where I'm going with this. How does that sit with Nkrumah's thoughts on neocolonialism?
Well,
because if you have all these bases, okay, fine.
No, but the United States has more than 80 bases spread over the African continent. So, China is a latecomer in that respect, and China is not there to really try to sustain a regime in power, unlike the United States in many cases where it has bases in African countries. The regime in Djibouti is already sustained by France anyway. France and the United States. But it's, rather than just isolating Djibouti alone, this is an occasion that we really should look at the entire African continent. Which African country really enjoys a complete sovereignty? I mean, the closest example, I think, was, of course, Libya. You see? Because Libya controlled its oil production. You see? Once you control your production and your assets, that to me is a measure of sovereignty. So let's contrast with South Africa, for example. South Africa, with all its minerals, who owns all those minerals? Who owns the money?
European economic interest.
South Africa is not in control of its sovereignty because it's not in control of its production. Libya was the closest example. So Djibouti really, is minor compared to all the other major countries like South Africa, for example. If South Africa does not control its sovereignty because it does not control its production, I can be a little more sympathetic to poor little Djibouti.
Okay, so all the best to Djibouti is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. I would rather pick on the giants like Nigeria first, Ghana, all those larger countries before I pick on Djibouti,
Okay. And, so that said, picking on foes and fighting wars and fighting battles, some necessary, some totally unnecessary. We've been talking about Congo of recent, and it's imperative that we keep our focus on the place in the course of all our deliberations going forward, at least when it's of substance. Now, one of the key players in
the Congo present crisis has been Corneille Nyanga. And your paper, or your magazine of choice, The Economist, has done a special on him, and I would share. And it reads, a leader of Congo's rebels, they're still using their term, vows to fight on. It is not clear that the recent truce in Congo will hold, and that's Corneille Nyanga. So, the story reads, Corneille Nyanga sits in an armchair in a 5-star hotel in Goma. Yeah, some sort of rebel officer he is. The largest city in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And stretches out his hand. Thank you for embracing the terrorist, he jokes, to laughter from his entourage. Mr. Nyanga, pictured, is the head of the Alliance Fleuve Congo, AFC, the political arm of M23, an armed group led by Congolese Tutsis and backed by next-door Rwanda. Last week, M23 and Rwanda captured Goma after a rapid offensive that featured drones and heavy artillery that shattered Congolese defenses. The UN says at least 900 people were killed, though some estimates put the death toll closer to 3,000. The escalation in fighting risks sparking a regional war. First, the 4 other Army countries that came to Congo's aid also failed to repel the invaders. Can you just speak to this first part before we continue?
Well, I mean, The Economist had been doing much better coverage on the Congo previously, but this article is very similar to the kind of propaganda piece that the BBC has been publishing about this conflict. This guy is not a leader of any rebel movement. He's the puppet of Paul Kagame, General Paul Kagame.
Yeah.
Kagame is the puppet master. So to try to humanize this guy and, in light of, I mean, this is mind-boggling. Almost in passing, you mentioned the number of people that have been killed.
Focusing on him.
3,000. You start off with the lead of this guy joking that this is the so-called terrorist they're talking about. And you're quoting the laughter by his comrades as if this is something to be joking about, given the toll of the death. So the framing of the article itself is very chilling. And, I don't know whether this is a European who is writing it or an African who is writing it, but it doesn't matter whether European or an African. It shows a level of
contempt,
disconnect, really. And as you say, utter contempt for the lives of Africans. We are hearing stories about women who were raped, women who were burned alive. And in all that context, you really think that this is the type of appropriate article that belongs here at this stage of this crisis? And no editor said, listen, I think this tone, this cavalier, your nonchalant tone is not appropriate at this time. What can I say? It speaks more to their lack of compassion and humanity toward Africans than to anything else.
Yes. Okay, I'll continue. It says, this is the part that got me the most. Mr. Nyangas, who has become the public figurehead of M23, strikes a relaxed tone. We want to wage a clean war, he insists, explaining that M23 pushed into Goma after years of laying siege to it because attacks from Congolese forces and their allies around the city. What does he mean by we want to wage a clean war?
I mean, that was left for the writer of this article to explain to us. And obviously, it is not there at all. Remember, a few weeks ago, we were discussing quotes, and this quote was from a BBC article, and it was one of the so-called M23 leaders, saying the Congolese government had not lived up to the promises of the peace agreement that had reintegrated them into the national army, when in fact the truth was the truth. This opposite was the truth. You know, the M23 had abandoned that arrangement by deserting from the national army. And yet that quote was not allowed, was not challenged by the author. It was just allowed to free float, so to speak. Similarly, here we have preposterous quotes just free floating. It just told us that UN estimates that 3,000 people may have been killed. And you allow the guy to say, we want to wage a clean war. And you don't say, wait, this is not adding up with the reality on the ground. You see? So we want all these writers to constantly be checking themselves.
Right? Yeah.
Checking themselves. And the only way you can force them to check themselves is by calling them out, you know?
Yeah. I'll take one final part from it, and it's this. Mr. Nyanga claims M23's fight is a local one. Our vocation is the absence of the state, he explains. We're Congolese, we have problems and demands that are Congolese. This includes, he says, ending the corrupt rule of Congo's President Felix Tshisekedi, his repression of the political opposition, above all, the exclusion of some ethnic communities, especially the Tutsis. Mr. Nyanga is not a Tutsi and has vowed to go as far as Congo's capital, Kinshasa, in pursuit of these aims. The cause is such that our young people may advance until the last drop of blood.
Yeah, there's the same nonsensical propaganda, which is chilling. You know, I'll belabor the point, but there's just utter lack of compassion to the value of African lives, you know, allowing this nonsensical quotes to maintain. He's fighting on behalf of Tutsis. That's a propaganda that's already been exposed. It's not true. General Nyawasa, who was Kagame's military chief of staff and is now exiled in South Africa, the one he tried to kill. On about 4 or 5 occasions. I said, this is just propaganda. There are prominent Tutsis in the military and government establishment in Congo. So that is not true. So that's just propaganda. And for the fact, and for his delusion that he's going to carry this battle
fight
to Kinshasa, that's just utter delusion, because, you know, any attempt to do that is actually going to backfire in a very bad way, because they will force South Africa's hands. South Africa will have to make a full deployment. Tanzania will probably make a full deployment, and they will repel them again, just as they did in 2012.
Yep. And they might actually then crush them finally.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. That brings us to the end of that story. But in the UK, there has been a story making the rounds. People are literally foaming at the mouth.
It's not foaming with happiness or sadness. Or it depends on who you are.
It depends on which side you are when you read this article. It is hilarious. I mean, there has not been an engagement with a news article like this extensively. One is the fact that, let me not even go. Let's just go to, first and foremost, set the scene. The paper comes, it's the Telegraph. Now, for those who are not aware, the Telegraph is effectively the paper of the establishment. It doesn't get more establishment than this. Lord Hermer calls British Empire deeply racist and fought for reparations.
Thank you, Lord.
Who is Lord Hermer? Lord Hermer just happens to be the Attorney General of the United Kingdom. He said, Attorney General said, all children should be made to learn about the empire's legacy of violence. As at the time I copied this post, this is the amount of people that have commented on it.
How many is that? I can't see from here.
An 88.
And it's probably gone up by now.
It would have gone up, definitely. Now, for those who don't know who Lord Hermer is, that's the gentleman right there. And
but you know what?
Go on.
He's right. And that is the problem. And the problem is not so much the ordinary people. The ordinary people would actually benefit tremendously by learning this history in the United Kingdom, in France, in Portugal, in Belgium, in Italy, in the United States. That is the path toward creating the world that we need for the present and for the future. And at some point, after much more destruction, much more bloodshed, much more stalemate, at some point, in order to preserve our existence and human beings on this earth, that is the conclusion that people are going to arrive at.
Yes.
It must be much, much later, when in fact it could be much, much sooner. And earlier. So people like Lord Hema, he's right. This is a European who's assessed the history and realized that we can never build a better world if we try to pretend that history away. See, part of the support that a person like Donald Trump has is Europeans who want to live the false narrative that history never occurred. Pretend it away so we don't have to address it and deal with it. So you may see superficial harmony, but when an arsonist like Donald Trump comes on the scene and says, let's keep the native where they belong, people who yesterday were pretending to be living in a harmonious environment, that repressed feeling suddenly erupts and comes to the fore. You see, of course, they know that history, but it's the denial. It's thinking that it's easier to live in denial than to address that history. But it's unacceptable because the products of those histories will keep showing up. You see? Yep. And manifest themselves.
Exactly.
And you can't kill all of them. You can't lock all of them in jail. You can't return all of them to Rwanda, which you can't anymore anyway. You can't allow them to drown in the oceans. You simply cannot make them disappear, just like you cannot make that history disappear. So this is what he's talking about. And I agree with him, without even having to listen to the details. I agree with him 100%.
You need to actually listen to the details.
I agree with him. The premise alone, he's in the right direction,
when you're reading something, you're like, okay. Then I remember who he was, but we will find out who he was in the paper. So he continues. The Attorney General has described almost every element of the British Empire as racist and revealed he fought to get reparations.
Yes.
Lord Hema, speaking on a podcast for his former Chambers Matrix, said the British Empire enforced a racial superiority that allows you to treat entire populations like school children. He said, almost every element of the empire was racist and that all children should be made to learn about its legacy of violence.
Yes.
Lord Hema's comments led Robert Jenrick. For those who don't know, Robert Jenrick contested the leader of the Conservative Party with Kemi Badenoch, who is, and he got the role of Shadow Justice Secretary, to describe him as Jeremy Corbyn in a barrister's week. Jeremy Corbyn is the socialist who used to lead the Labour Party, but again was undermined as an enemy of the state and effectively was pushed out in a palace coup. In Lord Hema's, Starmer is the head of the government, he's the Prime Minister at the moment, had brought back Corbyn in a barrister's week. He is describing Hema here, he is pro-boycotting Israel, supports reparation, celebrates just oil eco-zealots, and is anti-border control. his far-left political views are a risk to our country's security. He should be nowhere near the government. That's Robert Jenrick speaking. Why would he say he is, before you go, why would he say he is pro-boycotting Israel? He was the one that said once the United Kingdom will honor the decision of the International Court of Justice in terms of the warrant of arrest. Go on, you were saying.
And this guy thinks that should be an issue. I mean,
That's what Robert Jenrick thinks. He thinks that should be an issue.
A regime that may have killed 100,000 Palestinians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, he thinks if he whips that in, obviously that would bring in the so-called angry mob, and then they can set on it. But I'll continue with the piece. And it goes on to say, in 2013, Lord Hemmer helped force the Conservative government to pay out 19.9 million in reparations to more than 5,000 Kenyans, seeking damages for abuse under the British rule between 1952 and 1962. Could you give context to that?
That's very excellent. That's when they sued in the High Court, right? The
Royal Court of Justice.
Survivors of the torture and abuses by the colonial regime when they suppressed the liberation struggle led by the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. And demonized and denigrated as the so-called Mau Mau. By the British. That was a piece of justice, not the whole of justice, but it was a piece of justice, and it was a good one and an appropriate piece. So basically this article is about somebody who wants to build a real world and being countered by comments from reactionaries and those who would want to rewrite history. That's what the article is about.
Okay, I'll continue. Every line here is incendiary. Just, you will see all of them. So the Prime Minister's legal chief, which is the Attorney General, has also offered guidance to Caribbean nations seeking reparations for history.
This is the kind of guy I can actually sit down and have lunch with and have good, meaningful conversations.
Okay, go on. Speaking on the Matrix Law podcast in 2022, he said, racism impacted almost every element of the British Empire.
Absolutely.
The Attorney General said, go on, you want to say something?
No, I said absolutely, 100%. Listen, when you start by establishing the premise that merely because I'm European, I'm superior to you, everything else, of course, is going to be predicated on that racism. So he's right. How can it be otherwise? Every aspect, when we encounter each other physically at meet, I have to defer to you automatically, whether you're a mentally challenged person or not, it doesn't matter. And I'm healthy in my mind. It doesn't matter. The mere fact that you're a European, you're somehow automatically superior. And that's what he means. And I agree with him. Absolutely.
Okay, I go on. Speaking on the Matrix Law podcast in 2022, he said racism impacted almost every element of the British Empire. The Attorney General said Britain was a country where notions of empire remains a good thing, and that it was premised on a deeply racist assumption that other nations are not as good as us. He said, we seem to have this kind of myopia in this country, or certainly a collective amnesia when it comes to collective past. In order to buy into this notion of British exceptionalism, you can only do that if you ignore history.
You know what's so amazing about, you can take that exact quote and just take out, British or Britain and insert the United States.
The States.
And you wouldn't have to change a word in that quote.
Okay. Let me continue. So the pushback, obviously. classic nasty left-wing view of life. Sir Ian Duncan Smith, who a former conservative leader, suggested the Attorney General should learn to keep his mouth shut.
No, he should speak much more often, and more people should speak like that. He's wrong.
It is a classic nasty left-wing view of life. There is a huge amount that the British brought to the world, which has benefited the world dramatically.
The ledger of genocide outweighs all of that. Obviously, he has not read Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Rodney evaluated and weighed the ledger and said colonialism and imperialism was a one-armed bandit.
Yes. And he also negated to add that the idea of a concentration camp was a British invention.
Absolutely.
But at the Nuremberg trials, one of the generals there said, "Why are you blaming us? We are only perfecting what you introduced." So the British would first of all use that idea during the Boer Wars with the South Africa, would later introduce the same idea, guess where? In Kenya. And if people want to read about it, you could read Caroline Elkins. You can see the picture there, Imperial Reckoning.
And of course, there are descendants that already practiced it in the United States when they exterminated the indigenous population.
There we go. So I'll continue, and it says, so another one of his pushbacks comes from Richard Tees, the deputy leader of the Reform UK, that's Nigel Farage's party, said Lord Hemmer clearly hates Britain and is a clear and present danger to our country.
No, he hates racist Britain. He left out one word.
He continues, if these buffoons despise Britain so much, they should not be serving in government. We need ministers that believe in Britain, appreciate what we have given the world. That is a contribution to be celebrated, not denigrated, added Mr. Tees. Scholars were also critical of the comments, arguing labeling the empire as inherently racist neglected many of its positive legacies. Empire was an act of modernization. Professor Lawrence Goldman, an emeritus fellow in history at Oxford University, said Lord Hemmer's interpretation would have been entirely alien to those living under colonial rule.
Easy for a European to say, who's not the one being colonized, you know?
They loved it.
They contacted me. That's exactly what would have been my quote, you know?
Yeah, they loved it. We loved it. He told the Telegraph, it is better not to think about the history in terms of good and bad, blame and praise. You will have to accept all the time that mistakes were made and things were done. Professor Goldman said that the empire was an act of modernization which exported the rule of law, representative institutions, economic system, and above all, the one I'm speaking right now, the English language. He said these developments have a particularly positive impact in countries such as India.
No, it does not. In fact, it's withholding India's development. And to the extent that India has developed, it's based on what amount of its traditional cultures it had been able to maintain. Just as in the case with China as well. China, to the extent that China is developed, it's been able to develop because it's using the Chinese culture and Chinese history and Chinese legacies that survive the colonial penetration. Unfortunately, in many African countries, that was not the case. And that is why Amilcar Cabral used to constantly talk about going back to the source, going back to our histories, and embracing the traditions that we had. And the path that we had been pursuing in history before it was hijacked by colonialism. So China is able now to embrace a half market-based, half control-based economic system. But it's not confused by any Western cultures, any Western languages, any Western institutions. It has its own forms of government, and it's working for China and building wealth and prosperity. African countries, many of them have very confused systems. They're still dealing with the legacies of language. They're dealing with legacies of institutions, such as parliaments, where in some cases, brilliant people who come from the grassroots are not even allowed to be members of those institutions because they cannot speak a European language. Think about that. In China, are they denying brilliant Chinese from being in leadership positions in the government and in parliament because they can't speak English or French? Of course not. They're elected because they speak Chinese and they articulate their intelligence in Chinese. So they have the best leaders emerging through the systems that they have. We're eliminating some of our best leaders because they can't speak French, because they can't speak English, like the Queen's version, So in fact, he's revealing, in saying what he's saying, the so-called scholar, he's actually highlighting how destructive colonialism and imperialism was, particularly when it comes to Africa.
Yeah, let me finish this.
If it was that successful, we would not have to have a debate. African countries would be developed. So why is it that they're not developed? It's not like when they left, particularly in the 1960s, they left developed countries. No. So colonialism failed to develop that. So how could you say colonialism was beneficial?
Let's finish. I'll read a bit more. It says, this is still the Professor Goldman. Our public figures are far too quick to give their opinions. They know very little. He's talking to a legal scholar. He's referring to a legal scholar.
No, but it's not so much him. It is the publication itself. It's the Telegraph. Is this the only scholar alive? You could not find a scholar to say the things that I've been saying today.
Of course they can, but
so they don't even pretend that they want balance, and they allege that one of the essence of Western journalism is so-called objectivity. Utter nonsense. Not even pretending that there's another scholar who might have a different view from Professor so and so.
Okay. Our public figures are far too quick to give their opinions. They really know very little. When you point to possible scholars that could have given a counterbalance to this, one that comes to mind is Professor Hakim Abdi, the one who wrote he's wrote multiple books on the issue of colonialism and Britain's stuff, but he has been deplatformed. His college has been cancelled, the University of Chichester. Yeah, so Professor Nigel Biggar, who specializes in imperial studies at Oxford, added, contrary to cartoonish simplifications, the 400-year-long British Empire contained a variety of views. He said at the time, Britons may have felt superior because of the empire's scientific and technological advances. Sometimes that made British colonialists arrogant. Well, okay. But it also led them to emancipate African, in 1807 and grant the vote to native Canadian, South African blacks. When did he do that? And New Zealand's Maori on the assumption that they were capable of becoming equal citizens in countries that are now among the most prosperous, most liberal, and least racist. Okay, so first, 1807. Let's talk about that one. You want to go first?
Really, this is just an ugly rewriting of history that I think we give them actually much more legitimacy by overly discussing their racist and reactionary views, I mean, how can you liberate people that you yourself have been exploiting, beginning from enslaving them, right? And then you're celebrating that we are the ones that liberated them. Liberated them from who? From yourself? How can the jailer say, I'm freeing somebody, so therefore I should be given some credit and celebrated as well? I mean, it's just mind-boggling,
It reminds me of the quote from Malcolm X when he says, how could you stick a 9-inch blade into my back and pull it back 6 inches and you expect me to be grateful?
Yes, that was
Who
brilliant.
Who put the blade there in the first place?
It was brilliant by Malcolm,
Yeah. I mean, the 1807 stuff, that is easily debunked because when France lost Haiti, Britain tried to go back in, but they were also defeated. And on the issue of emancipating African slaves, they didn't do it out of their own altruistic. They actually compensated slavers. You can read about that in Michael Taylor's book, The Interest. Basically, they took out a loan to the degree of 25 million pounds at the time, a quarter of the state's budget to compensate the enslavers. On the issue of granting votes to South African blacks, that victory was won on the battlefield, first and foremost with the victory at Battle Koto Carnival, and then the subsequent push on South Africa based on the boycotts of the apartheid government. So there's no kudos for that. And one final thing from Lord Hamer. Lord Hamer admitted, his comments come after he admitted he had to recuse himself from giving advice to the government on potential conflicts of interest. The Telegraph recently discovered that he had contributed a handbook which advised Palestinian victims on how to use the UK courts to sue companies that sold arms to Israel.
Oh, I love this guy.
That's why I said
I love this guy because
there.
The guy is brave and courageous. He's going to get a lot of backlash. It could cost him his job, but obviously he's saying it willingly and knowingly, and he's willing to live with the consequences. So we need more people like that.
Yes. And on that very positive note from Lord Hamer, and we've come to the end of another episode of African News Review, and it's been a pleasure as usual having Comrade on to discuss the stories with me. And Comrade, any final thoughts?
I think, even when we see dire circumstances such as we see in the United States right now, I want to encourage our viewers and our listeners that, the struggle is not a linear process. It's never been a linear process, There are gains, there are setbacks, and then there are gains. But so long as the inequities that govern much of the world persist, so long as there are enough people who are sharing knowledge and education to the people who are the victims of these inequities, then it means there's always hope that there will be change, right?
Yes.
We just have to keep struggling, and we have to continue analyzing and connecting the dots. And that is how we give people hope. We give them the knowledge how to continue resisting and struggling to create a better world.
Yes.
We're obliged to do that anyway. You see? You can never give up. Even in the most dire moments when apartheid was at its most powerful. I remember having a conversation with a Ugandan diplomat. It's a long time ago. I would say maybe more than 20 years ago. And we were talking about apartheid in South Africa. More than 20, because apartheid, you're talking 30 plus years. Actually, way before even, Mandela was released. Right?
Yep.
Way before the Battle of Quito. And he said, apartheid will not end in our lifetime. And I said, I totally disagree. And at that time, this is way before Quito Carnival, when apartheid still seemed so powerful. said, no. And he said, why are you that confident? I said, because whenever you have that type of inequity, people will wake up every day thinking and push, how can we bring the system down? And whenever you have enough people thinking like that, the system will come down. And I'm convinced it will happen in our lifetime, So you see a Trump. How long is a Trump? And the Trump phenomenon, how long is that going to last? It's already having some serious backlash already, It's just a manifestation of the kind of reaction you're seeing to Lord Herbert's article. Those who want to step forward and say, let's acknowledge the truth and the reality of our path. And let's use that knowledge to build a better future. As opposed to those who are saying, let's ignore that history, let's pretend it never happened, and let's keep resisting and live in the world of unreality. That's represented by the Trumps, you see, and the millions that still support him. On the other hand, you have millions that are coming to deal with the facts, like our Lord Hamer type. And I think that is where the future lies, personally.
Yes. Hamer spoke about the legacy of violence. There is a 800-page book written by Caroline Elkins, aptly titled A History of the British Empire, Caroline Elkins. There's no ifs, buts, or maybes. It's all there. It's documented, referenced, and, So, you were saying, final thoughts.
As I always end, a luta continua. I'm a very hopeful person, and I encourage others to be that way too.
I would support that and say, yes, keep fighting the good fight. And as the great Kwame Ture, or Stokely Carmichael, as more widely known, is organize, and organize.
Absolutely.
So, good evening, and until next time, good night for now.
Asante sana.
That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review Podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.